Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we will be taking a look at game number 10 of the FIDE World Chess Championship between Liren from China and Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia. All right, let's jump right into the action. So as you guys know, going into this game, Nepo is leading by a score of 5-4. Very critical 10th game. This is one of the last 3 games which Liren will have with the white pieces. So really critical to try to put pressure on Jan and create something dynamic. So all right, the game starts with c4 here. Knight to f6, knight c3 and e5. And already when white plays c4, you know that it's headed for an explosive opening. So we get knight to f3, knight c6, classic English opening with the 4 knights variation because all sides have brought out these knights. And now we get to move e4. Now in the past, a certain grandmaster by the name of Hikaru Nakamura, who also is a streamer, has played this e4 variation very frequently. He played it in 2019 en route to winning the United States Chess Championship. He also played it very recently in the 2023 American Cup in the final of the winner's bracket against Grandmaster Wesley So this Hikaru guy seems to have played this line here or there. Now it's worth noting that in this match, this move e3 was played before by Ding. Additionally, queen c2 is a move that we saw in the leaked games that were played on Lee Chess between Liren and Richard Laporte. So I think everybody knew that we wouldn't get this queen c2 move, even though Grandmaster Fabiano Caruana put out a tweet hoping for this variation. So we get e4 here, and now Nepo plays the move bishop c5. Now bishop b4 is also a move that is completely playable here. It's what I have played quite a few times with the black side, and additionally what I have faced in every single game from the white side. Now bishop b4 and d3 is very standard here. You get d6, a3, bishop c5, b4, and bishop b6. And generally speaking, the position is considered pretty balanced. There have been many top games played by Wesley, myself, Magnus Carlsen, and others. However, bishop c5 is a much more direct and forcing variation. Now, the reason bishop c5 is much more forcing and direct is that here, if white tries to play a move like d3, simply opening up the diagonal for the dark square bishop, black can now go knight g4, pretty much winning on the spot because you have no good way of guarding this pawn on f2. Additionally, if you play a move like bishop to e2, for example, after d6 and d3, black can simply go bishop g4. And what's happened is black has gotten the bishop on c5 in one go versus the other variation where you've wasted a tempo. Basically, after bishop b4, d3, d6, a3, bishop c5, white has played a3 and d3, d6 have been included. So his a3 move is very important because white can go b4. Whereas in this position, after bishop g4, black has the bishop on in one go, and white has not played a3 yet. So here, white plays knight takes e5. Now this is generally considered the drawback of playing bishop c5 as opposed to bishop b4. Now this line is also very forcing, very concrete. The next 4 or 5 moves are pretty much automatic for both sides. So after knight takes e5, black chops the knight. We get d4 here played by Ding, forking the bishop on c5 and the knight on e5. Game continues with bishop b4. We get d takes e5, and now knight takes e4. White cannot capture the knight due to the pin from the bishop towards the king on e1. And now we get queen to f3, knight c3, b takes c3, and now this move bishop c5 is played here by Nepo. Now it's worth noting that this has been played quite a few times. I don't remember when exactly the very first game that was played in this line was, but one of the most important early games was this move bishop a5, which was played in the game between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana in the Isle of Man in 2019. Now it's worth noting because that is a tournament that I played in. I was on the top boards at the time, and I did take note of that game. Now the game was very wild, very sharp. It did end in a draw when all was said and done, but it's considered to be very complex. At any rate, we get the move bishop c5 being played here by Nepo, and now we have this move queen g3 played by Ding. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that after bishop c5, Ding used approximately 11 minutes before playing queen g3, and after king to f8, he sank into a deep think here. Now, what does this tell me? Now, one of the things that's very important to note is that Ding has traditionally been very slow in these games in the opening phase. Sometimes it's remembering move orders and whatnot, but it was very clear from the press game interview that was done afterwards that Ding simply was playing by the sort of the seat of his pants, as we like to say, to use an English expression, and he had not prepared this very seriously in depth. Now, once again, this is a world championship match. The players have many months to prepare, and so for Ding to be in the situation after this king f8 move where he was seemingly out of his preparation was a big surprise. Now, it's worth noting, of course, that after queen g3, king f8 is the best move. If black chooses to castle here, after white plays bishop a6, black has to give up the rook here. If you don't sacrifice the rook with g6, you simply get checkmated. You can't capture the bishop due to the pin. If you go queen f6, I simply take your queen. And so the only way to stop mate is to play g6. And after takes bishop e2, black is still actually not doing terribly here, but white is for choice with the rook for the bishop. At any rate, king f8 is played, and now Ding Ding sinks into a deep tank. Now it's worth noting that in the press game interview afterwards, he did mention this move g6, but after g6, if white plays a move like bishop e2 and castles, white is significantly better here. You can tell from the bar that white has an advantage. Now once again, very surprising because king f8 is the best move. It's recommended by computers instantly, so who knows what Ding was doing. Maybe he simply had not looked at this bishop c5 variation recently, which to me, frankly, as someone who's played top level chess, is just inexcusable, because in this position after b takes c3, you have to look at both bishop c5 and bishop a5. Worth noting that when I did play Wesley So in the American Cup about a month or a little over a month ago, I had looked at bishop c5 a little bit, and I had looked bishop c5, by the way, I mean on move number 4, I had looked at this a little bit, as well as bishop b4, and of course I had also looked a little bit at this variation with bishop c5, queen g3, and king f8. So simply inexcusable in my opinion that Ding apparently had not reviewed this variation or even missed it completely. So game continues with bishop e2. Nepo plays d6 instantly, opening up the diagonal for the light square bishop. We get the move bishop to f4 being played, and now we get this move queen e7. Idea behind queen e7 is very straightforward. If white were to trade the pawns on d6, white has problems castling the king out of the center of the board here. If you castle, black can simply take the bishop here. Same thing for going to the king side, and with this disruption here, it's very hard to get the king out of the center, and black will have time to develop the bishop, bring the bishop out, bring the rook to the center very quickly, and even though the king is on f8, black has more than enough counterplay. So here Ding plays the move rook d1. Now it's worth noting once again in this position, it's very sort of fixed. The pawn structures are fixed. White really can only trade the pawns on d6. Additionally, black has a very clear-cut plan. Bring the bishop out, bring the rook out, and in the long run, if a bunch of pieces come off the board due to these stacked pawns on c3 and c4, black should be completely fine. So after rook d1, Nepo plays h5 pretty much instantly. Very clear at this point in the game that this was straightforward preparation. Nepo is well within his book. Now h5 looks a little bit weird, but there are a couple of reasons that this move is justified. First of all, if white were to take on d6, let's say takes and rook d6, if you capture the rook with the bishop after bishop takes d6, white is simply winning the queen. However, with the pawn being on h5 after rook takes d6, black can go bishop to g4 here, and if white plays a move like f3, suddenly there's a move like rook to e8 potentially, and all of a sudden black's bishops are very active here. The king is stuck in the middle of the board, and white is going to have to struggle to prove that he can survive in this position. So very interesting move played by Nepo. h5 idea to play bishop g4. Now of course we don't need to get into the depth of why it's necessarily the best move, because the computer pretty much instantly suggests it as the top idea. However, there is one other idea, which is, let's say that we have a trade of all the pieces here on d6. Black can potentially play rook h6, simply activating the rook, where you can bring the rook out to a6 or c6, and suddenly this rook on h6 will become a very powerful piece. So here Ding decides to castle instead of going into any of the complications. Nepo plays this move h4, tickling the queen on h4 and asking Ding, where are you putting the queen? We get this move queen to d3 here, and now Nepo finds an excellent move after a bit of a think with this move g5. Now this might not be the top computer move, but what it does is it forces a massive simplification. Computer also likes moves like bishop d7 or bishop e6, offering to give up a pawn on d6, but white does not have to trade the pawns on d6 here. Whereas when black plays g5 and Nepo does this move, white has to go into this endgame here. Now you would love to avoid the endgame, just move the bishop away, but after you move the bishop and black takes, you can't play f4 due to the pin of the bishop towards the king. And if you play a move like king h1 after bishop f5, queen to d2, targeting the pawn on g5, black has h3 here, and suddenly there are all kinds of problems. If you play a move like g takes h3, rook takes h3, suddenly there's a checkmate on the open h file. If you play g3 here to stop it and closing off the h file, black can go bishop e4, f3. Now this very nasty move, pawn to g4. You can't really push the pawn forward, and if you take the bishop after queen takes e4, you can't move the king due to the bishop, and after bishop f3, g takes f3. As we can tell from the counting of the material, black simply has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you have the double pawns as well as c3 and c4, so black is completely winning. So Ding definitely did not want to trade the pawns on d6 here, but you have no choice. So he takes on d6. Of course, Nepo recaptures. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, queen d6, bishop d6, rook d6, bishop to e6. And now the smoke is cleared. We're in a situation where basically black is down a pawn. However, white's extra pawn is a doubled pawn on c4 or c3, and black can very easily go after this pawn. Additionally, the pawns on the queen side are very stable here. Let's say we get a3 b6. You can't really go after these pawns, and once again, rook c8 is a massive threat here to go after the pawn on c4, and black should be completely fine. To make matters worse, black can also just go king e7, and this bishop on e2 is also not a great piece. If you could magically transport the bishop to d5, for example, white would potentially be able to undouble these pawns and prove that the extra pawn is worth something. Here, however, the bishop on e2 is very passive, as it simply guards the pawn on c4. So Ding plays this move f4, which I really like here. The idea is that in this position, if you just play quiet moves like rook d1, king e7, rook d2, and b6, followed by rook c8, let's say a3, rook c8, rook d4, and rook c5 to illustrate the point. Black wants to go rook c8, stack the rooks, and go after the pawns on c4 and c3. Additionally, there are really no weaknesses on the king side either with this pawn chain, so black has no issues at all. So what Ding tries to do here is play f4 and break up the pawn chain on the king side, and after we get king e7, rook d4 takes, now the pawn on h4 is quite weak here. It's worth noting you can't play f6 because after the pawns come off, white can simply go rook e4 here. Very simple idea. If you play a move like rook d8, I have bishop g4, pinning the tail on the donkey, and when you move the king, I go rook d1 check, king moves, and you lose the bishop on e6. So you'd love to play f6 and keep the chain intact, but you can't. So Nepo trades, he goes h3, avoiding hanging the pawn in h4, and now Ding plays this move g4. Now this is probably the most critical point in the game, and it's a very difficult decision here, because in this position g3 is probably the best move for one very simple reason. What g3 allows is it allows you to play bishop g4 down the road. So say black goes rook f8 and you get bishop g4 here. If you can trade off these bishops on e6, for example, and play rook h4, the pawn on h3 remains very weak here, and you might have two connected pass pawns marching down the board. Whereas in the game, g4 makes a lot of sense because you can simply go king f2 and g3 and go after the weak pawn on h3. But as it turns out, this concept of g3 and let's just say rook a c8 and bishop g4 here, it's still probably a draw, but white actually ends up with better chances of winning the game due to the light square bishops coming off the board. Now again, it's a very nuanced plan. It's not something I would expect someone to play right off. I think the only way that you could play g3 is if you knew how the game is going to turn out, and as we know, neither player is a time traveler as far as we know, and so you can't see what the future holds. However, having said that, based on what happens in the game, g3 would have been a better move just to go bishop g4, but Ding plays g4, which is very logical too. We get rook c8, king to f2, and the idea is also quite simple. White wants to go king g3 and try to gobble his pawn on h3. Nepo plays rook c5 here, activating the rook, maybe a double stack to target the pawn on c4, but more importantly, if white plays a move like king g3, black can go rook to a5, trying to win this pawn on a2. So Ding plays a4, which I thought was an excellent move here, because now after rook to a5 is played, targeting the pawn on a4, we get bishop d1. And what you'll notice is the bishop on d1 guards both the pawn on g4 and a4. We have a pyramid, but more importantly, you have the stacked rooks on the fourth rank, which also guard these pawns on c4 and g4. So with the rooks on d4 and f4 guarding the pawns, bishop guarding d1, the rook on d4 guarding the bishop, it looks like white can go king g3, grab the pawn on h3, and try to win. Now at the time when I was doing my live coverage, already here I felt very optimistic about Ding's chances, but unfortunately after this move b6, king g3, and rook h6, it's very hard for white to progress. The main reason is because you can't really push the g pawn, because that would simply hang the pawn. So you can't push the g pawn, you can't push the c pawn, neither of these pawn pushes are available. Additionally, your bishop, while it protects the pawn on a4, it's a very passive piece here, and you also can't really move the rooks. If you go rook d2, I'll just go rook c5, attacking the pawn. You'll have to go back and we start over from scratch once again. So even though at this point I felt really optimistic about what was going on in this position, unfortunately black can kind of just sit and wait because the bishop is tied down to the pawns. You can't really move the rooks anywhere because they're guarding the pawns, and the d file is completely closed here. So white actually does not have much of an advantage, even though you have one extra pawn, and the pawn on h3 is potentially very weak. So the game continues with rook fe4. Now Ding used a long time here, or maybe it was the move before king g3, used a long time trying to come up with some plan here, and he isn't really very successful. Now you could play bishop c2 with the idea of playing bishop to f5, but once again after king to f8, if you try to go bishop f5 here, I can simply trade the bishops, and after rook takes f5, I just have rook a4, and when you create the kebab with rook to d7, I can very quietly go rook h7, guarding the pawn, and essentially we're going to end up in a situation where most likely the two pawns here will be traded for these two pawns on the edge of the board, and that would lead to a draw. Now this is the second big problem that you have here, which is essentially if we end up in a situation where I'm trying to set this up just to do something, so ignore the evaluations, of course. But we've ended up in some situation where basically you get something like this, and you get a position like this where white has a rook and 2 pawns versus a rook and 1 pawn. This will always be a theoretical draw. White can obviously try to play on, but it will be a draw. So it's worth noting that at this point, what you have to do with white is somehow you need to win the pawn on h3 without liquidating all of these queenside pawns, which proves very difficult. So Ding plays rook fe4 with a different concept, which is now if black plays rook h8 trying to just sit and wait with the rook on h8 and h6, white can go rook to d5. An excellent move here, because now if you trade the rooks, the bishop is pinned, you lose the bishop, and with it you lose the game. And if you play a move like rook to a6 here, now white can go bishop c2, and you no longer have the 5th rank, so you have to go rook c8 trying to stop c5. And now after rook d4, you have to go back to h8, and now white can play rook to e5. And their ideas here, like let's just say king e8, rook h5, and after takes, suddenly this h pawn is going down the board very quickly. If you move the rook away, I simply gobble the pawn on h3, and white now has 2 extra pawns and should be completely winning. Unfortunately, there's this move king to f8 here. Basically a quiet move. It dodges rook d5 tricks. There's no pin on the e file, and now you don't really have anything great to do. Again, you can always move the bishop to like c2, but I will just start dilly-dallying with rook h8, rook h6. And so here Ding instead decides to play the move rook d8, trying to enter with the rook, trying to play logically, trying to create something if he can. Nepo goes king g7, of course. King e7, of course, would walk into rook to d5 once again. So king to g7 is played, and now we get the move rook to a8. Now at this point, again, it's very hard. Bishop is tied down to the pawns. Pawns on c3 and c4 are very weak. So Ding decides to go rook a8. The idea is now if black ever plays rook c5, you can take the pawn on a7. Unfortunately, rook c5 is played here, and now Ding decides to take the pawn on a7. Now Ding could play a move like bishop to e2, but now I simply go back to a5, and again you're tied down having to guard this pawn on a4. And if you play a move like bishop b3 trying to guard all the pawns, there are probably several ways for black to play, but probably simplest is rook a5, guarding the pawn, once again stopping all the pawn pushes on the 5th rank, and white just can't really do a whole lot here. So the game continues with rook takes a7. We get this move bishop takes c4, and now the game really is simplifying here. There's really very little chance for Ding to create any counterplay, frankly, because the pawns on c3 and a4 are weak. Rook on h6 guards h3, but it can always swing over to either c6 or d6 and enter via the d file or the c file. And already here for Ding, he's looking at this trying to figure out what's the easiest way to make a draw. So the game continues with rook e7. We get rook h6. The idea is to stack the 2 towers, move the bishop away, and take the pawn on c3. Now it's worth noting once again, you're more than happy to give up this pawn on h3, because after bishop e6 and rook takes c3, all roads here are going to lead to a draw in this endgame, because again, it's a 3 versus 2, and with the active rook, probably simplest is to go bishop b3, forcing bishops off the board, and now we'll end up in a situation where the a and b pawns come off, and this will be a theoretical draw. So here Ding plays rook 7 to e5. We get rook takes rook, and now Nepo does not make any mistakes here. He plays his excellent move bishop to b3, sacrificing the bishop temporarily, but ensuring that we head to the specific endgame that I already mentioned, with a rook and 2 pawns versus a rook and 1. Now the problem here is that if you move the bishop to f3, I take on c3. You can't take h3 here due to the pin, and you lose your bishop. Also a4 is weak, so you can't move the bishop to f3. If you go rook e1, I simply take on c3 check anyway, and I'm fine. So you have to take the bishop, and after rook takes c3 check, now you have to move the king. I take the bishop on b3. I still guard the pawn temporarily, and now the game really simplifies pretty much instantly. We get rook to b5 played by Ding here. Now you cannot trade the rooks, because after you trade the rooks in this endgame with 3 pawns versus 2, the king and pawn endgame, white is actually winning. So Nepo plays rook to a3 here. We get rook takes b6, rook takes a4, and now king takes h3. Now again, white has an extra pawn on the king side, but there are many ways to draw this endgame. You can even just play rook a3, king h4, rook a2, h3, and rook a3, and eventually this will be a draw. Let's just say g5, rook d3, king g4. You go back, h4 check. If king h5, you just wait on this 4th rank forever, any of these squares. White can't really make progress here because the king is stuck on the edge of the board. No retreating square to g4, and this would be drawn soon. Additionally, if you play a move like h3, rook a3, and I don't know, like rook b4, now you can just bring the king up, and again, all roads lead to Rome, and this will be a draw very soon. Nepo, however, in sort of the spirit of playing precise moves, doesn't even let any of those setups happen. He plays this move f5, gambiting a pawn temporarily, but after pawn takes pawn and rook f4, white can't really save this pawn at f5 easily. Actually, you can't save it at all. And so game continues with rook b5, king to f6, king to g3, and now rook takes f5. And at this point, it's a very basic draw. Even if rooks don't come off the board with an edge pawn here, the h pawn, this is just a straightforward draw. This will be drawn 100 times out of 100. So Ding decides to trade the rooks, goes h4, king g6, and now h5. Now it's a little bit disappointing. I would have loved to have seen the stalemate with king g4, king h6, h5, king g7, king g5, king h7, h6, king h8, king g6, king g8, h7, king h8, and king h6, but we don't get it. Instead, Ding plays h5, and after king takes h5, we have bare kings on the board, a king for each side, and obviously neither side can checkmate. So we get a draw in game number 10 of the World Championship match. So what are my takeaways? First takeaway is obviously for Jan, every game that he saves with the black pieces makes it much more likely that he's going to win the match. I think it's going to be very difficult for Ding to create chances to win with the black pieces. So Ding now will only have 2 more white games in games number 12 and potentially the last game, game number 14. He's still down by a point. Feels like he's kind of running out of steam in these openings, and with so many ideas having been used, it feels to me like it's getting more and more difficult. Now again, as we know from the classic baseball slang from Yogi Berra, it feels to me very much like it's getting late early. It feels like Ding is kind of running out of time already, even with 4 more games left. So if he's unable to create something very exciting tomorrow, it's all going to rest, in my opinion, on game number 12. But we will see what happens at the end of the day. There's still 4 more games. Anything can happen, as we've already seen from this match, which at times has been very topsy-turvy. But we've now had 3 draws in a row. It feels like both players are sort of settling into a groove. And we'll see what happens tomorrow in game number 11 when Jan Nepomniachtchi has a white piece against Ding Liren. Still a 1-point lead. If Jan can win tomorrow, the match is effectively over. But we play chess to see what happens. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. I know the game was a little bit boring, but it is what it is. Not every game of chess can be super exciting unless both players really want to go all in. So make sure you hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and we'll be back tomorrow with another recap after game number 11 of the World Chess Championship match being played between Ding Liren and Jan Nepomniachtchi. See you guys. Bye.